You ever wonder how one person's moment of doubt, a real crisis of faith, could spark a movement that literally changes the world? Well, today, we're diving into the story of a failed missionary whose personal breakdown accidentally set off one of the most influential religious revivals in modern history.
Right, that's the big question here, isn't it? We're about to see how one man's spiritual struggle didn't just stop with him. It became a fire that jumped across an ocean and completely redefined faith for millions of people.
And that man is John Wesley. Now, he wasn't a king or a general or anything like that. He was an Anglican priest whose personal search for a more authentic, real faith ended up launching the global Methodist movement, pretty much by accident. But to get how that happened, we've got to look at the world he was living in first.
Okay, so before we dive deep into Wesley's personal story, let's pull back for a second. What exactly is a Christian revival? Because, it's way more than just a couple of really popular sermons.
The easiest way to think about it is like this. Today, an idea can go viral online, right? It spreads like wildfire and it can change culture, it feels like overnight. Well, a revival is basically the spiritual version of that, an intense, widespread, and really contagious burst of religious passion.
So here's the more official take on it. From the perspective of believers, the idea is that these revivals aren't man-made campaigns. They're seen as something bigger, a way for the church to get a reset, especially after a period where faith has kind of grown cold and society's maybe lost its way a bit.
And look, this wasn't just a one-off thing. History shows us these things tend to come in waves, especially in America, with these periods called the Great Awakenings. And John Wesley's work? He was a huge part of what kicked off that very first wave, which blew up into this massive international phenomenon.
All right, so with that bigger picture in mind, let's zoom right back in on our guy. From his earliest days, John Wesley was on this relentless, all-consuming quest for a faith that actually felt real, something more than just going through the motions.
And you can really see this intensity back when he was at Oxford University. He led this small group of students who were just super disciplined. They were visiting prisoners, taking care of sick people, praying constantly. They were so structured, so methodical, that other students started making fun of them, calling them the Holy Club, or, you guessed it, the Methodists. It was totally meant as an insult, but hey, the name stuck.
So in this search to make his faith deeper and to be a missionary to Native Americans, Wesley does something pretty radical. He sails for the new American colony of Georgia. He thought it would be a chance to live out this purer, more, back to basics kind of Christianity.
Yeah, that trip, it was a complete and utter disaster. He got himself tangled up in some legal trouble, a romantic relationship went south, and he basically had to flee the colony in shame. Instead of finding that spiritual certainty he was looking for, he sailed back to England feeling like an absolute fraud.
But something really important happened on that trip back. A huge storm hits the ship, breaks the mast, and while all the English passengers are panicking, Wesley sees this small group of Moravian Christians, and they're just calmly singing hymns. He, an ordained priest, was terrified he was going to die. They were completely at peace. That contrast just shattered his confidence and made him question everything.
And that crisis, that rock-bottom moment, leads us to the absolute turning point of the entire story. Back in London, totally depressed and feeling spiritually defeated, Wesley is about to have an experience that wouldn't just change his life, but the course of religious history.
On the night of May 24th, 1738, he almost didn't even go. He pretty much had to drag himself to this small religious meeting on a street called Aldersgate, not expecting to feel anything but that same old spiritual emptiness.
But then, something happened. While someone was reading from Martin Luther's writings, Wesley felt what he described as his heart being strangely warmed. For the very first time, he didn't just believe in salvation as an idea, he felt it. He felt this assurance that he was saved. This was it. This was that real, personal feeling he'd been chasing his whole life. This was his own revival.
Honestly, everything up to this point was just the prologue, because this experience didn't just make him feel better, it lit a fire under him. It gave him this radical new confidence. The guy who felt like a fraud now had a message he truly believed in, and he was going to share it with anyone and everyone who would listen, no matter what.
So when the established churches basically shut their doors on him, what did he do? He just broke all the rules. He took his message straight to the people, preaching in open fields to these massive crowds of coal miners and factory workers, people who probably never felt welcome in a traditional church. And in a move that was totally radical for the time, he empowered regular people, not just ordained priests, to go out and preach too.
And the sheer scale of what he did next is, well, it's just mind-boggling. Over the course of his life, he preached over 40,000 sermons. I mean, think about that for a second. That is more than one sermon every single day for 50 years straight.
And to deliver all those sermons, he was always on the move. He covered 250,000 miles. That's about the distance to the moon. And he did it almost entirely on horseback, crisscrossing Great Britain and Ireland, just relentlessly building this network of followers.
But here's the thing. It wasn't just about giving great speeches. Wesley was an absolute organizational genius. He built a system that could actually scale. He had lay preachers traveling on regional circuits, small weekly class meetings for people to support each other, and a big annual conference to make sure everyone stayed on the same page. This system, this structure, this was the method in Methodism.
Now, this whole revival thing wasn't one big happy family. A huge theological split happened between Wesley and his friend, another super famous preacher named George Whitefield. Here's the core of it. Wesley believed salvation was available to everyone who chose to have faith. But Whitefield was a strict Calvinist, and he believed God had already predestined who was going to be saved and who wasn't. It was a major disagreement that split the movement right down the middle.
And you know what? The impact of this movement went way beyond just church stuff. It started to change the very fabric of society by taking on some of the biggest social injustices of the 18th century.
And when it came to the biggest social issues, Wesley did not pull any punches. He became a fierce opponent of slavery, calling the slave trade, and I quote, the sum of all villainies. He used his huge platform to condemn it, and he directly inspired some of the key figures in the fight for abolition, like William Wilberforce.
So when you look back, his legacy is just one of massive social change. He fought against slavery, he formally empowered women to preach way before that was a common thing, and he set up tons of charities and schools for the poor. The same man who was once mocked and kicked out of churches died as maybe the best-loved man in England.
Which really brings us full circle. John Wesley's story shows us this powerful formula. You take a deep personal conviction, you combine it with some organizational genius, and you meet a deep need in society. That's how you turn a personal crisis into a tidal wave of change. And it kind of leaves us with one last question. In our own super-connected, often divided world, what are the forces creating the revivals of today, whether they're spiritual, social, or even political?